A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. So, picture this. It is August 1973. A man walks into the credit bank in Stockholm, Sweden, pulls out a submachine gun, and takes 4 employees hostage in a bank vault. For 6 days, these people are trapped. But when the police finally gas the vault and end the standoff, something bizarre happens. The hostages actually shield their captor from the police. They refuse to testify against him. One of them even starts a legal defense fund for the guy. That is where we get the term Stockholm Syndrome, and today's prompt from Daniel is asking us to look at that exact phenomenon alongside brainwashing and ideological capture.
It is a classic starting point, Corn, but what fascinates me is how these mechanisms have migrated from bank vaults into the modern world. We saw a case just last year, in 2025, involving a high-level tech executive. He was part of this intense corporate ideological capture program for 18 months. By the time he left, he was using the exact same rhetorical shields for the company that those bank employees used for their kidnapper. He was fundamentally transformed, not by a gun, but by a systematic dismantling of his identity. By the way, for the listeners, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash.
It is funny you mention the tech exec, because it feels like we are living in a giant distributed version of that bank vault sometimes. Between remote work isolation and the way algorithms feed us specific worldviews, the physical walls are gone, but the psychological ones are higher than ever. It makes me wonder if we're all just a few bad weeks, and a persuasive boss away from defending our own captors.
That is the big question. We need to distinguish between these 3 things because they often get lumped together. Stockholm Syndrome is specifically that trauma bond formed during an acute crisis. Brainwashing is the systematic, often forceful dismantling of a person's core beliefs, and ideological capture is more of a voluntary, though deeply coerced, adoption of a totalizing worldview. They all exploit the same cracks in the human hardware, though.
So, what is actually happening in the brain when this capture occurs? Most people think it's just a choice or a sign of weakness, but it sounds like there is a much deeper biological script running in the background.
There absolutely is. We have to look at the neurobiology to understand why a rational person would start sympathizing with someone who is objectively threatening their life. A major Stanford study from 2024 looked at the neurochemistry of hostage situations and found a very specific interaction between cortisol and oxytocin. Normally, cortisol is your stress hormone. It's there for fight or flight. But when you are in a state of prolonged, inescapable stress, your brain starts searching for any possible avenue of safety.
And if the only source of safety or mercy is the person holding the gun, the brain does a bit of a backflip, right?
Well, not exactly in the sense of a choice, but the brain begins to interpret the captor's lack of violence as a positive act of kindness. If a captor gives you a glass of water or a blanket, your brain releases oxytocin, the bonding hormone. You have this massive spike of cortisol from the threat, and then a sudden hit of oxytocin from the small mercy. The brain misinterprets this as a deep, intimate bond. It's a survival mechanism. If I can bond with a predator, maybe the predator won't eat me.
It's like the ultimate toxic relationship, but on high-speed internet. I remember reading about a journalist back in 2023 who was held by a militant group. She talked about how one of the guards gave her an extra blanket on a particularly cold night. She testified later that in that moment she felt a more profound sense of love and care from that guard than she had from her own family in years. Rationally, she knew he was the one who put her in the cold room to begin with, but the neurochemistry didn't care about logic.
But think about the specific mechanics of that moment. The guard creates the cold, then saves her from it. It's a cycle of manufactured distress followed by relief. In a hostage situation, the captor becomes the entire universe. They represent the sun, the rain, and the food. When your world shrinks to the size of a room, the person who controls that room becomes a godlike figure. Your brain isn't being stupid, it's being incredibly efficient. It's optimizing for the only reality it has left.
That shrinking of the world is a terrifying concept. It reminds me of the Patty Hearst case back in the 70s. She went from being a kidnapped heiress to a bank-robbing revolutionary named Tanya in a matter of months. People at the time couldn't wrap their heads around it. They thought she was faking it to stay alive, but the psychological evaluations later showed she had undergone a genuine, albeit forced, identity shift.
That is the cognitive vulnerability window. Research suggests there is a critical 72-hour period after capture or isolation where the human identity is most malleable. If you can control someone's sleep, their sensory input, and their caloric intake for those first 3 days, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that does the rational, critical thinking, starts to go offline. You become almost entirely reliant on the amygdala and the limbic system. You are basically a toddler again looking for a caregiver.
So, if the caregiver is also the kidnapper, the wires get crossed. It's basically parenting for psychopaths. But what about when there isn't a physical kidnapper? You mentioned ideological capture in a corporate setting. How does that work without the submachine guns?
That is where it gets really insidious. In that 2025 Silicon Valley case I mentioned, the company didn't lock anyone in a vault. Instead, they used alignment sessions. These were 12-hour daily marathons of high-intensity group therapy and ideological training. They combined digital isolation, no personal phones allowed during the workday, with a constant stream of us versus them rhetoric. They created an environment where the only way to reduce the psychological stress of the job was to fully adopt the company's extreme worldview.
It sounds like a cult with a better stock option plan. How do they handle the pushback, though? Surely someone in those sessions says, wait, this is insane.
They use a technique called milieu control. It's one of Robert J. Lifton's 8 criteria for thought reform. You control the communication within a given environment. If someone pushes back, they aren't just disagreed with, they are framed as unaligned or toxic. The group then turns on them. Because the employee is already isolated from their family and friends due to the workload, the threat of being cast out by the group is equivalent to a death sentence for the social brain. The stress of being an outcast triggers that same cortisol spike we talked about earlier. To lower it, you conform. You start saying the words, and eventually the words become your thoughts.
It's the Home Depot version of Stockholm Syndrome. Do it yourself. But seriously, if we know the 72-hour rule, shouldn't that be part of basic psychological literacy? Like, hey, if you haven't talked to anyone outside your bubble or slept more than 4 hours in 3 days, maybe don't make any major life decisions or join a new political movement.
You'd think so, but the problem is that when you're in the window, you don't know you're in it. That's the whole point of the prefrontal cortex going offline. You lose the ability to self-monitor. That's why external accountability is so vital. You need people who are outside the vault, who have the permission to pull you out before the door locks.
I've seen this play out in online spaces too. You get these echo chambers that act like a digital vault. You spend 72 hours straight in a specific corner of the internet, sleep deprived, fueled by outrage, and suddenly anyone who isn't in that vault with you is an enemy. You start bonding with the loudest, most aggressive voices in the room because they feel like the only ones protecting you from the outside world.
The digital isolation aspect is key. In the 1970s, you had to physically kidnap someone to achieve this level of capture. In 2026, you just need a persuasive algorithm and a user who is already feeling socially isolated. Once you sever a person's ties to their existing support networks, friends, family, even a different news feed, you create that same vulnerability window. The brain starts looking for a new tribe for safety.
It's fascinating because the algorithm doesn't even need to be evil. It just needs to be optimized for engagement. If outrage and tribalism keep you on the app, the algorithm will inadvertently create the conditions for ideological capture just to hit its KPIs. It's like a machine accidentally building a brainwashing chamber because it noticed that people in brainwashing chambers don't ever leave.
That's a chilling but accurate analogy, and once you've been captured, the logic of the ideology provides a shield against any outside information. This is what we call loading the language. You create thought-terminating cliches. Short, catchy phrases that stop any critical inquiry. In the corporate case, it was phrases like radical transparency or alignment is duty. If you had a doubt, you were told you were operating from a place of ego. How do you argue with that? If you argue, you're just proving you have an ego.
It's a closed loop, a perfect psychological trap. I'm curious about the second-order effects. What happens when the bank vault opens? Or when the tech exec finally quits? You'd think they'd just be happy to be out, but it's never that clean, is it?
Never. The psychological adaptations that help you survive captivity are actually quite maladaptive in the real world. One of the biggest issues is the shattered narrative. To survive, a victim has to build a story where their captor is good, or at least understandable. When they are released, that story crashes into reality. They often feel a profound sense of guilt or betrayal, not against the captor, but against themselves. They can't reconcile the fact that they loved someone who hurt them.
It's like a software patch that was written for a specific broken operating system. Once you're back on the standard OS, that patch starts crashing everything. I imagine trust becomes almost impossible. If you couldn't trust your own brain to identify a threat while you were in the vault, how can you trust your brain to pick a friend at a coffee shop?
That is exactly what former cult members and hostage survivors report. There is a deep, pervasive self-doubt. In post-capture therapy, the focus is often on narrative reconstruction. You have to literally go back and rewrite your own history with the knowledge you have now. You have to tell yourself, I didn't love them, my brain was just trying to keep my heart beating. It's an incredibly painful process because it involves admitting you were vulnerable.
Does it ever truly go away? Or is that capture signature always there in the background, like a scar on the brain?
It's more like a physical injury. You can heal and you can regain full function, but you'll always be aware of where the break happened. Some people develop a hypervigilance toward any kind of group influence afterward. They become anti-joiners. Others, unfortunately, are more susceptible to being captured again because they've already had those neural pathways paved. It's a phenomenon called cult hopping. You leave one totalizing system and immediately look for another because the vacuum of having to think for yourself is too terrifying.
It's interesting how this connects to our political worldview, too. We often see these massive swings in public opinion, or these intense ideological movements, and it's easy to just call people brainwashed. But if we look at it through this lens of capture, it's more about the environment. If you create an environment of high fear and low information, people will naturally gravitate toward the strongest captor in the room.
And that has huge implications for policy and how we structure our digital lives. If we know that sensory deprivation and isolation lead to identity dismantling, then we have to look at the digital chains we're putting ourselves in. We're basically building our own vaults and then wondering why we're becoming so radicalized.
I wonder about the role of physical sensation in this. You mentioned sleep deprivation and caloric intake. In the modern world, we are being starved, but we are being overstimulated. Does a sensory overload work the same way as sensory deprivation?
In many ways, yes. It's about bypassing the executive function. If I can flood your brain with so much conflicting data and high arousal emotion that you can't process it, you eventually give up and look for a simplified key to explain it all. That key is the ideology. Whether you are in a dark room with no sound or a bright room with 1,000 screaming voices, the result is the same. The prefrontal cortex checks out and the survival brain takes over.
So, the takeaway is basically, don't put all your psychological eggs in one basket. Which sounds simple, until you realize how much our modern world encourages us to do exactly that. Everything is about total immersion and passion and commitment.
We've pathologized moderation. But in the context of psychological survival, moderation is your armor. It's what keeps that 72-hour window from opening. We also need to talk about the role of AI in this. As we move into 2026 and beyond, we're seeing personalized AI that can mimic human empathy perfectly. Imagine a captor, digital or physical, who has an AI assistant that knows exactly which mercies to give you to trigger that oxytocin spike.
That is a terrifying thought. A Stockholm bot. that is programmed to bond with you by exploiting your specific neurochemistry. It wouldn't even need a gun, it would just need your data. It could play the good cop to the world's bad cop, 24/7.
This is why understanding these mechanisms is no longer a niche interest for hostage negotiators. It is a fundamental survival skill for the 21st century. We are all being negotiated with every time we pick up a phone. The goal of any capture system is to make you feel that your survival, emotional, financial, or physical, depends on your loyalty to that system.
It makes me think about the recovery side of things too. If the capture is neurobiological, the recovery has to be as well, right? You can't just logic your way out of a trauma bond. You probably need to rebuild those neural pathways through actual physical safety and consistent, non-threatening social interaction over a long period.
You need corrective emotional experiences. If the capture happened through a cycle of fear and mercy, the healing happens through a cycle of safety and consistency. You have to prove to your amygdala, over and over again, that safety doesn't have to be conditional. In many ways, the hardest part of surviving brainwashing isn't leaving the group. It's learning to live with the person you became while you were in it. There's a lot of shame involved. People look back and think, how could I have said those things? How could I have believed that?
I think we need to be more compassionate toward people who have been through this, whether it's a literal hostage situation or a digital cult. If your brain is hardwired to bond for survival, you shouldn't be ashamed of surviving. You should be angry at the people who exploited that hardware.
That is a crucial distinction. The syndrome isn't a defect, it's a feature of the human brain that is being used against the user. It's like a cross-site scripting attack on the human psyche. The code is doing exactly what it was designed to do, keep you alive. It's just being fed malicious input. We see this even in smaller scales, like trauma bonding in abusive relationships. The victim isn't weak. Their brain is just trying to navigate a minefield by befriending the person who laid the mines.
So, what's the move then? If I'm a listener and I'm starting to feel like my job or my online group is getting a little too vault-like, what do I actually do? Is there a fire drill for your brain?
First, break the 72-hour cycle. Get physical distance, get sleep, and most importantly, talk to someone who has zero stake in that environment. A tether to reality. If you find yourself making excuses for why you can't talk to outsiders, that is a massive red flag. That is the capture speaking. You need a dissent partner, someone whose job it is to tell you when you're starting to sound like a pamphlet.
And maybe take a break from the outrage machine. It's hard to be ideologically captured when you're busy looking at a tree or talking to a neighbor about their lawnmower. The mundane is the enemy of the totalizing ideology. The captor wants you focused on the grand mission or the great threat. They don't want you thinking about whether you need to buy more milk.
The more specific and real your world is, the harder it is for someone to overlay a fake one on top of it. Ideological capture requires abstraction. It requires you to care more about the cause than the person standing in front of you. Regrounding yourself in the physical world is like pulling the plug on the brainwashing machine.
Or a brother who will tell you when you're being a donkey.
Hey, I resemble that remark, but you're right. Resilience isn't just about being strong. It's about having a diversified portfolio of identities and connections. If your entire identity is based on one job, one political party, or one online community, you are a prime candidate for capture. If that one thing turns on you or puts you under pressure, you have nowhere else to go. You're in the vault, and they have the keys.
This has been a heavy one, but honestly, it's some of the most important stuff we've talked about. It really makes you look at your own loyalties a bit differently. Are you loyal because it's a good choice, or are you just trapped in a vault with a very nice blanket?
It's a question worth asking every day. And it's not just about individuals. Organizations, families, and even nations need to ask, are we building communities based on shared values and voluntary association, or are we building vaults? If the only way to keep people in is through fear and isolation, you haven't built a community, you've built a prison.
Well, that's our deep dive into the vault for today. Today's prompt from Daniel really took us into some dark corners, but I think the light at the end is that we can build resilience if we know what to look for. It's about keeping that prefrontal cortex online and keeping our tethers to the real world strong.
It's all about the hardware, Corn. If you know how the machine works, you're much harder to hack. Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flemingtop for keeping the wheels on this thing and ensuring we don't fall into any echo chambers of our own making.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. We couldn't do these deep dives into the neurobiology of the human experience without that horsepower.
If you're enjoying the show, a quick review on your podcast app helps us reach new listeners and keeps our own vault growing. The good kind, where everyone is free to leave and different ideas are always welcome.
Find us at myweirdprompts.com for all our episodes and ways to subscribe. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Stay skeptical out there.
And get some sleep. 72 hours, remember? Catch you next time. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow.